Good evening. I'm Allison Schilling, Senior Program Officer at the Concord Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's forum with Richard Rhodes on his new biography of the late E.O. Wilson. Richard Rhodes is the writer or editor of 22 books, including Twilight of the Bomb, the last volume in a quartet about nuclear history. The first volume, Making of the Nuclear Bomb, won the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award and the National Books Critics Circle Award. He has received numerous fellowships for research and writing, including grants from the Ford Foundation, the Guggenheim Foundation, the MacArthur, and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. Thank you to Mass Audubon for partnering with us on this program, and welcome to all members of Mass Audubon who tuned in to join us this evening. This spring, the museum is opening a special exhibition in partnership with Mass Audubon titled Alive with Birds, William Brewster in Concord, which explores the life and legacy of Mass Audubon's first president, William Brewster, and features paintings and sculpture from the Museum of American Bird Art and artifacts from the Concord Museum, Harvard's Museum of Comparative Zoology, and the Chesterwood Archives at Williams College. I encourage you all to come to the museum this spring and see the stunning exhibit that delves into the life of someone who dedicated over 30 years of his life to the study of birds in Concord and advocated for the protection of birds and conservation of their habitats. I hope you enjoy the program, and I'll now turn the virtual floor over to Tom Putnam, Director of the Concord Museum. Thanks.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you, Dick, so much for joining us this evening to discuss the life and legacy of Professor E.O. Wilson. I so enjoyed reading your new biography over the past week. I recommend it highly to our viewers. It's on sale here at the Concord Bookshop in town. And I know you mentioned, I'll call him Professor Wilson, I know you call him Ed, that he actually read The Galleys to correct any factual errors, but that he actually did see the finished edition before he passed away.
He did, just barely, I must say. Yeah.
And he was, I'll note for those who don't know, he was our neighbor next door living in Lexington, and many of his friends at Brookhaven, where he and his wife Irene spent their final years, are joining us here this evening, so we welcome all of you. So I thought we might go sequentially through his life, Dick, but before we do, if there's someone tuning in who isn't really all that familiar with Professor Wilson, could you, in a few sentences, just summarize why he really was such an important figure in the latter 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century?
Sure. Ed was, first and foremost, an entomologist, a biologist who studied insects. And his early years he spent really taking over and commanding a field that had very little attention in the 1950s when he first started out as a young man, as a young Harvard professor and a young biologist. And that was the study of social insects, ants in particular. But he grew across his lifetime to cover more and more biological ground, if you will. Writing, after he wrote the definitive book about ants, beginning to look at the social activities of other species, up to and including human beings, which got him into a good deal of trouble. We'll talk about that, I'm sure, because there were at least many scientists around him who didn't like the idea that some of our general behaviors might be rooted in our genetics rather than simply being socially learned after we're born. In the late 1970s, when it became clear that the extinction rate of all the life forms was increasing, it had been commonly believed that one species a year of the 10 million or so in the world went extinct. Then some new studies indicated that it was more like one a day. And Ed was energized to step forward as a champion of doing something about this loss of species because, as he said, if you cut down a rainforest, you can replace it perhaps in 100 years. But if you cause a species to go extinct, that's the product of millions of years of evolution, and it's gone. It won't be back. And so in the final years of his life, from let's say around the year 2000 until his death just a few weeks ago, actually, uh, he championed primarily getting a handle on the number of species in the world, identifying them. It turned out that some large proportion of the species, especially the smaller critters, what he called the little things that make the world, the insects and similar creatures, not to mention all the fish in the sea, by and large, had never even been identified, much less given a name, their behavior described. And that really was the work of his final years, to expand. He came finally to the notion that maybe we should save half the earth for wilderness and use the other half for human life. And he, being a good scientist, did the numbers and concluded that we could support ourselves very nicely on half the land mass and ocean mass of the world.
Right.
So across his lifetime, this young man who started out as a barefoot boy in rural Alabama, out in the woods, just running around on his own and being fascinated with the natural world, became really one of the world leaders up there, along with people like Jane Goodall, in trying to save what's left of the natural world so that we won't be bereft and the only species left on Earth, if indeed we would be.
Well, let's go back now and start with that barefoot boy. I want
Yes.
to talk a little bit about his childhood, and I know he moved around a lot, but Alabama was what he considered home.
He was born in rural Alabama in 1929. And his parents, very uncharacteristically for the 1930s, divorced when he was 7. His father was a curious figure, a smoker and a heavy drinker and a gambler who was also, and I find this a bit paradoxical, auditor for the Rural Electrification Administration. One doesn't think of people who are auditors and CPAs as being necessarily wild, drunken alcoholics, but that's kind of what Ed's father was. So Ed was kind of left on his own a lot, and that meant that he was indeed something of a Huck Finn figure as a boy. There was a turning point early in his life that really shaped his direction, above and beyond his love of the natural world that he developed just by being an only child out in the woods. And that is, he was fishing one day and he flipped a pinfish, a little fish that has 12 very sharp spines along its back, into his eye and punctured his cornea. And because he was being cared for by some fairly careless sort of rental people who had been provided to him that summer, they never really paid attention to the eye, and he developed a traumatic cataract and eventually lost the use of that eye entirely. He also, evidently, in his family line, there was some genetic problem with hearing. So by the time he was a teenager, he was half blind and half deaf. That limited sharply the kind of field work he could do. And particularly, he had, I think, tended to be interested in butterflies and in birds. But you can't really, if you don't have binocular vision, it's hard to see those creatures. And if he fortunately had very good vision in his remaining eye, close up. And so inevitably he ended up settling on insects as the creatures that would become the focus of his study as an adult scientist.
And he had a remarkable discovery at age 13. Tell us more about that.
At one point when he was 13, living in a big old house in, I'm blocking on the town. It was, do you recall? I've forgotten.
That's all right.
It was, well, wherever he was living in a port town in Alabama, and in a big old house that his family had inherited. Next door was a vacant lot, just a trashy vacant lot. He decided that he would make a complete inventory of all the insects in the vacant lot, something that's a standard scientific thing that you do when you're studying a particular area, but really very uncharacteristic for a 13-year-old boy who was just then beginning to start up in scouting. Uh, he identified a number of species around, and then there was this mound over in one corner of the lot with these little, very small ants that were nasty stingers. They would, if they stung you, it would cause a little welt to rise up, which inevitably would form a little pustule, and it would take several days to go away. And as he told me, it felt very much as if someone had touched your skin with a burning match. Those he couldn't find in his books, and realized eventually after doing the homework he needed to do that this was the fire ant. The fire ant is a native of Brazil and had made it all the way to Uruguay by then, and then had evidently come into port on a freighter. But he found it when it was first beginning to expand its habitat across America. It's now all over the world. It's a very vigorous ant, but it's also a terrible pest. He did some studies later on at the age of 18. When he was just starting college, he was hired by the state to work up a study of fire ants as a way of beginning to think about how to control them. And one of the things he realized was that they were expanding outward in a hemispheric shockwave, if you will, at about 5 miles a year. And of course, as I said, by now they've taken over the entire United States. There is one super colony, for example, that extends from San Diego to Seattle. The entire west coast of the United States, all genetically related, one giant colony. So the fire ant is obviously a very successful weed, if you will, invasive species, but it has caused a great deal of damage in the South.
We'll talk a little more about his research on ants, but it really is remarkable that at age 13, he's kind of discovered a vocation. I was curious, in high school, one of his heroes was Robert Oppenheimer, who clearly you know a lot about. Did you ever talk to him about Oppenheimer, and do you understand why he was a hero to a young Ed Wilson?
We did talk about it. I think Ed was intrigued with Oppenheimer for the same reason I was intrigued with Oppenheimer, although I think Ed's credentials were more appropriate than mine, that this man was a really first-class scientist. Most people don't realize that Oppenheimer published a paper in 1929 predicting what came to be called black holes. And although he never himself won a Nobel Prize, had he lived long enough for the black hole really to be discovered, he probably would have. So he was a really good scientist, but on top of that, he was a poet. He was a great reader of literature. He taught himself Sanskrit so he could read the Bhagavad Gita in the original language. All of these things, I think, resonated for Ed, but also, this is a side of Ed that people tend to miss because he was such a courtly and charming gentleman of a man, and very easygoing and comfortable to be around, laughed a lot and told wonderful stories. Ed was very ambitious. He wanted to be a great scientist, and he saw in people like Oppenheimer and some of the other great scientists who worked on the first atomic bombs a path, a way, and a sort of entrepreneurial quality that Ed himself had, always to push yourself beyond your limits, always to get to where you were challenged personally by an undiscovered aspect of the natural world or the physical world, in the case of the physicist. So he did identify clearly with Oppenheimer. He was a better man than Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was a pretty mean guy to a lot of people. Ed, I think, was never deliberately mean to anybody. Except
So
perhaps philosophers. He really didn't like philosophers very much.
this question of ambition, he goes to the University of Alabama and then he graduate work initially in Tennessee. He ends up at Harvard, but why don't you talk a moment about his father's death and how that is played a
Yeah.
role in this young man's ambition? Tell us that story.
It was really very complicated for Ed. He didn't think he could afford to go to college. And so when he was a teenage boy, he set out to put aside as much money as he could gather so he might have enough to go on his own. He didn't think his father would be around because of his alcoholism. This was a man who would dry out every year or two by going to some place where he could have inpatient treatment and then come back and pick up his work again as a government servant. But it was clear his father was declining over the years. He had an ulcer back when nobody knew what caused ulcers and so forth. So Ed got a job as a paperboy and delivered some 450 papers every morning all over town before he went to school for the day. He then finally realized that he tried to join the military just after the end of the Second World War, when most people don't realize this, but people with only one eye were allowed to join the military all through the Second World War. They didn't, of course, do combat, but there were plenty of other jobs that needed able-bodied men. And Ed was almost within the frame, even though the war was over, of the permission to allow one-eyed people to join the military, but he missed it really by just a few months and was bitterly, bitterly disappointed because he just didn't see how he would ever get to college. His father tried to talk him into going through a BA and a master's and then coming home and supporting his father, Ed Sr., and Ed Sr.'s wife, Ed Jr.'s stepmother. And he just felt that was going to ruin his life. But his father evidently reached the point where he decided he didn't want to become what he told Ed was described as a Bowery bum. He said, I don't want to become one of those guys, stumble bums walking down the street. And for Ed, that was the reason behind his father's decision one day to take his target practice rifle and go out and sit down by a pond and shoot himself, kill himself. It freed Ed from this burden of family responsibility. It left him with the puzzle of suicide. And if you go to his book, Sociobiology, you find paradoxically in a book that's a hard work of science, he opens it with a discussion of Albert Camus and Camus' work on suicide. Clearly, he had to somehow find a framework for this. It's interesting because he does something later when he tries to deal with religion, when he finds he no longer has the ability to believe, even though there was a period when he was born again and all those things, like the good Southern Baptist boy he was. Later on, he takes religion and realizes that it's a very powerful force socially for humanity, and therefore needs to be encompassed in the world of understanding what's central to human life and what makes it possible for our species to have been as successful as it was. So he did something like that with his father at this point in his life as well. Found in his father something like an act of courage for his suicide, freeing Ed to a life, freeing Ed Sr. from a decline that he thought would be, that he was too proud to face, I think is the best way to say it.
So let's fast forward. We won't be able to cover all of his life and this freedom, which is perhaps best personified. He gets to Harvard. He's earns a junior fellowship, very prestigious, and he takes a trip to the South Pacific. Tell us why that's such an important moment.
Ed was quickly picked up by a special program in Harvard Graduate Studies called the Junior Fellows Program. The very best of the very best are tapped and basically allowed to do whatever they want for 3 years. They're not, this is usually after they've finished their doctoral studies, but haven't yet necessarily acquired a doctorate or at least not moved on. Excuse me. Ed had finished his graduate work and was doing studies of ants for his junior fellowship. And at the end of that, wasn't really quite ready yet. So the Harvard Museum asked him if he would make a collecting trip. He already had a good reputation as an entomologist. A collecting trip through the South Pacific, which had never been done. There had been individual islands where people had collected ants. Australia had a certain amount of collection already in hand. But basically, it was a virgin field. And Ed jumped on it and realized that, I mean, he'd like to say, if everyone's working in one area of your field, run the other way as quickly as possible and find something that very few or none are actually working on, because that's where the gold is. And there was that entrepreneurial spirit again coming out, I think. So he spent a glorious 9 months wandering around the South Pacific, going to islands where no one had ever collected an ant before. He sent home something like 1,000 new species of ants. And he really, really made the Harvard Museum just greatly enriched its entire collection. He did a certain amount of work in Europe as well on the way home, where he would match the species he'd found with the ones in old European collections. But in the process of doing this, and Ed was a very private man. He was very, very difficult to get him to talk about his private life. And he really never did it and wouldn't. One of the reviewers of my book criticized it for having so little about Ed's family life. Well, he didn't talk about his family life, I'm sorry to say. He was about to marry a young woman whom he met when she was his dance instructor. He decided, well, it's probably time now that I'm a graduate student to date and meet a young woman and marry and so forth. But he said, I didn't know how to dance. so he went to a dance studio, and here was Irene, who was dancing, teaching dancing partly to support her family because she had a sister who was mentally ill, who needed care. Ed admired that immensely. So he and Irene struck it off immediately. They were just about to marry when this opportunity to go through the South Pacific came along. And he had to convince her to wait for him. And she had to be convinced that he would wait for her. So they agreed they would write each other a letter a day for the entire time that he was gone. And they did, by and large. Whenever he was any place where he could get to drop a letter in a box, he sent her a letter. And I insisted when I sat down with him to discuss doing his biography that I could not do it unless he would let me read all those letters. And he thought about that quite a lot and discussed it with Irene, I think. And then one day I got a box full of old bent and folded and worn blue airmail envelopes of various kinds and took all the envelopes apart and had them all copied and transcribed. And here was this gorgeous narrative of his time in the South Pacific, interspersed with lovely things back and forth between the two of them about their love for each other. He visited the island where lived the planter and his wife, who were the models for the planter and his wife in the musical South Pacific, because James Michener, as a young naval officer, had been based there and had befriended this French family and loved the cooking. They served Ed one night, one of the local delicacies, the flying fox, which was a kind of fruit bat, and it was just awful. Ed couldn't get 2 bites down. He had just had a bad case of tropical dysentery, so he wasn't well. Anyway, maybe that affected his taste buds. Anyway, he came home well set up. He could have spent the rest of his lifetime just studying the collection that he put together on that one trip. But he was a man who grew and grew and grew.
Let's talk about his rivalry with James Watson at Harvard. They arrive in the same month, and will you tell the story about
Well, it's really quite extraordinary. Watson was hired by Harvard after, of course, his discovery with Crick of the structure of DNA, which Ed deeply, deeply admired. He said they did something none of the rest of us did. Whatever else we've done, we didn't do anything that even approached that in terms of its primacy as a scientific discovery. So Harvard hired Watson, and then he immediately said, I need a 1-year sabbatical. This is Watson, of course. He was a very brash man. I need a 1-year sabbatical so I can go to Oxford and study with someone, fill out a certain area. So they said, fine. So Ed and Watson both started Harvard as assistant professors the same year. Watson was, I think, a year younger than Ed or older than Ed. In any case, Watson came with the full intention of sweeping clean the biology department at Harvard, which, as far as he was concerned, as he liked to say, was a collection of stamp collectors, of bird watchers, of people who would find one species, and this was true, this tended to be the way it was done in those days, find one species and spend your life studying it. Watson, to the contrary, had decided that you didn't need the field anymore to do biology. You didn't need to go out and study animals in their natural habitat. You just needed a good chemistry and physics laboratory. It would all be done at the level of the molecule now, because we knew what that molecule was. And to be fair, that's a little bit of a caricature. He understood he was going to need a big laboratory and a lot of people working with him and a lot of big expensive machines. And he wanted to get rid of the stamp collectors. So Ed was horrified. Ed's whole work was field work, and increasingly, as he moved into his professorship, laboratory research with ants in cages, as it were, in boxes. And Watson was an extremely rude person, and who felt he had to be that way in order to get the job done with this big transformation in biology. So Ed one time called, in fact, he liked to call Watson the Caligula of biology. They didn't speak to each other in the halls, not because Ed would not have. In fact, I think Ed was rather bothered by the fact that Watson would just breeze by him and not say a word. So they had a real struggle for quite a while, and more of the professorships as they came up and became available were being filled with molecular biologists. And Ed started a movement in the other direction. He believed very much that what Watson had brought to biology, which was a focus on mathematics and science, basic science, chemistry, physics, was something that field biology and organismic biology needed, that it had become too much a collection of specialists in one small part of the field. And he worked in that direction as well. And eventually there was the moment when Ed, because Stanford tried to grab him off when he was 29, offering him a full professorship and many other goodies, including a house, which Harvard hadn't bothered to help him find. Harvard suddenly realized that they better grab him and give him tenure before he got away. And he got tenure some 2 weeks, I think, before Watson did, and Watson was just horrified. He was seen walking through the building swearing the same 4-letter word over and over again, one of the 2 worst words there are, depending on who tells the story. But eventually, Watson went on to Cold Spring Harbor, I think, and modified his belligerence because he understood he had to, and did a beautiful job of building a whole wonderful laboratory system there. And eventually later, when Ed was attacked and almost crucified for sociobiology, Watson came to his defense, and they finally did reconcile and became friends in the fullness of time. But they were both ambitious men. They both had a lot they wanted to do.
Let's just talk a little bit more about ants now, because he wasn't just a stamp collector or just collecting ants. He discovered how ants communicate to each other. Tell us a little bit about
Ed's largest single contribution to science, to etymology, was in discovering the way ants communicate. No one had quite figured it out. There was some sense that it might be pheromonal. There was some sense that it might have to do with the ants tapping their antenna together. Maybe it was electrical. Ed did studies and see if it was magnetic. The ants weren't interested in magnetism at all, he quickly discovered. But he did increasingly focus on the probability that it was a pheromone trail that the ants laid when they were out, when the scouting ants were out finding food, and they found something. They would run back to the nest, laying a trail with a little opening just below their stingers and their abdomens, attached to a very small gland. I mean, almost invisible to the naked eye. And he didn't have the money or the time and patience to learn to operate elaborate microscopic equipment to find it. So he got this giant magnifying glass about the size of my computer screen, big, and would hold these ants, which were about the size of a good sized breadcrumb. I mean, fire ants, which was his study subject. Fire ants aren't very big; they're only about 1/4 of an inch long. He would hold these things up and smash them with the little tiny tweezers and squeeze out the various glands in their abdomen, which is quite full of various glands. And he finally found this one little tiny gland underneath the stinger. And when he dabbed a little piece of balsam wood into the fluid in that gland and laid a trail, he said the ants just came bursting out of the nest, following up the trail, and then milled around in total confusion because there wasn't any food at the end of the trail. It just came to an end. So then he did a lot of experiments around this trail system. There was not yet the equipment that he needed to prize out it turns out, much more complicated collection of different glandular secretions. It wasn't just from one gland, but indeed there was something like 40 or 50 different types of secretions that all mixed in to form various kinds of trails, depending on what the message was. I think in the end, Ed figured out that the ants had about a 25-word vocabulary using these fluids. Why did they not speak to each other in some other way? They lived underground mostly, and you can't see, there's no light underground, so you had to find smell-related or sound-related methods for communicating, as do termites and other underground creatures. One of his experiments, which I'll just very quickly tell because it's a rare example of comedy in serious science. He noticed one day that when ants died, and they die regularly, they live about a month, each individual, with the exception, obviously, of the queen, that they would just stop wherever they were and be left there, and that the worker ants who cleaned the nest regularly wouldn't move them out into the trash pile outside for 2 or 3 days, which was very odd. Ants are very tidy creatures. So he thought, well, he finally figured out that the odors of decay inside the ant took several days to find their way through the rigid exoskeleton that ants have. They don't have internal bones, they have a skeleton on the outside. Once he figured that out, he thought, well, I want to see how this works. So he would take a dead end and mash it and then collect up some of this in this decay liquid and make a little trail with it, and or put it on, he put it on a little stick of balsam, and the cleaner ants would go and pick up the stick and take it out and put it in the pile. Then he thought, I wonder what would happen if I put this on a live ant. So he dabbed a live ant with some of this decay fluid. The workers came over, picked up the live ant, which is kicking like, wait a minute, I'm not dead. Carry it outside and put it on the pile. And then it would clean itself off for a while and then try to come back in. But it still had the odor on it, so they'd pick it up and throw it in the pile again. It took 2 or 3 occasions like this too. Ed loved this experiment and spent a lot of time in his lab thereafter showing it to people till he got totally bored with it and moved on. But of course, that was an interesting and useful discovery. Nobody knew that before.
Right. I can tell we're going to run out of time. I should remind viewers you can submit questions via the chat feature. I was going to skip over island biogeography, but it's an important moment. Maybe briefly explain and how it got him thinking about evolution and extinction.
One of the ways that Ed moved into more mathematically oriented science was to find, he was not a particularly good mathematician himself. He didn't even get calculus under his belt until he was a professor. And he was sitting with undergraduates. It was kind of embarrassing studying calculus. But he found biologists with strong mathematical training. And one in particular, who would have been one of the great ones, but he died young, was Robert MacArthur. And with Robert MacArthur, he studied the curious way in which if you have a barren piece of soil, let's say the cone of that volcano that blew up out in Tonga a few days ago, that's going to be a sterile piece of land eventually. And then it will begin to be colonized by creatures that come in by land and by sea and by air. And others will then come in and there will begin to be interaction between and among these various species. Some are predators, some are prey, some are parasites, some are parasitized. They were interested in whether you reach a balance between addition and extinction on that particular place in the course of time. And they found indeed by studying islands that you do. But Ed wanted to take it a step farther and try to understand how this colonization process takes place. So he took one of his graduate students and they went down to the Florida Keys, where there are lots of tiny little mangrove islands, typically not more than a half an acre or less, maybe 40 or 50 feet across. And there are various distances from the shore, which means it takes more and less effort, depending on that, to get from the land out there to colonize these little islands. But then they had to make it sterile. These were not sterile places. They weren't little volcanoes. So they realized they were going to have to fumigate these little mangrove islands that they were working on. So eventually they found a guy, an exterminator in Miami, who was willing to take on this interesting project. And he came out and tried various methods to put tents of canvas cloth, the kind that people put over houses when they're getting rid of termites, over the island, and eventually hit on a nice kind of tent system. And then they would go out, Ed and his assistant and the workmen, and they fumigated an island and checked to be sure all the little life forms there were all gone and dead. And then they took off the fumigation tent, and then Ed's poor graduate student for the next year had to live down there and every day go out to this little island and do an inventory of all the creatures. And they did find indeed that there eventually was a balance. There's a famous graph that shows the two curves of extinction and colonization coming together. And it tended to stay at the crossmark between the two. The extinctions pretty much matched up with the others. More deeply, the work on island biogeography, as Ed and MacArthur called it, was eventually the basis for our present way of thinking about, I mean, we've carved the world up into a bunch of what you could call islands, pieces of land, pieces of water, forests, isolated now with farmland around them, that are very similar, ecologically speaking, to islands. And the question is, how big a piece of nature reserve do you have to have for the species that you've saved there to stay there, not to become gradually extinct because there aren't enough and they're not properly balanced? Mm-hmm. That became the basis for the kind of work that Ed was doing later, to try to see what could be saved. And they worked out things like, if you have two separate pieces and they're not big enough, can you build a causeway between them, right, that would allow the creatures in both sides to go back and forth safely? And that, as I think your audience will recognize, are some of the ways that we work today to preserve what's left of this patchwork wilderness in the world. So it really had, it started out as a pure experiment, and it slowly evolved into a methodology for really important ecological work.
So we'll come back to the ecology, but let's do sociobiology. So he writes the book Insect Societies, and then he decides that he should write a book about vertebrates. So tell us the evolution of sociobiology and then the controversy that emanates from it.
So Ed was trying to study the social behavior, first of insects, and he did a whole book, The Insect Societies, as you said, which really covered the entire field up to the year he published the book. I mean, he read every paper ever written on the subject up to 1971 when the book was published. Then he wanted to do, he realized that the next thing that people should do would be the vertebrates, the animals with backbones. But he couldn't find anyone who was brave enough to take on that huge project. He wasn't an expert in vertebrates. He was an expert in invertebrates. But he thought the book needed to be done, so he said, all right, I'll do it. And he set out to read everything he needed to read and collect together and so forth. And this then was going to be a book about the influence of, primarily of genetic factors on social behavior in vertebrates. And he called that influence, or that new field that he invented, a whole new field of science, sociobiology. Well, everybody was fine with it for the first 26 chapters of this giant book. It's like 800 pages in coffee table size. It's a heavy book to carry around, as most of his books were. But the last chapter, which he almost didn't write and wrote very tentatively, is about human beings, about Homo sapiens. Because after all, why would we be uniquely fitted to have no evolutionary influence in our behavior when all the rest of the animal kingdoms do? Well, that's never been something human beings are terribly comfortable with. The whole idea that we were created separately from the animals still lingers in the back of our prideful heads, I'm afraid. So, and in particular, there was a group of Marxist scientists at Harvard and around Cambridge who truly wanted to believe and tried to prove, never, I think, successfully, that human beings uniquely were born as tabula rasa, as blank sheets, as that sterile island, if you will. And everything that, all of our behavior came from social learning. This was ultimately probably because of their belief in a Marxist world, where Marxism argues that you should be able to change an entire society. And indeed, that had been the effort of the Soviet Union for many years. They jumped on Ed with all 20 feet of them. And particularly when there was a review of sociobiology in the New York Review of Books, they wrote a really vicious letter saying Wilson is wrong, his facts are all wrong. And then this is the part that really bothered Ed. And this is a resurgence of the old eugenics movement, which seems to be moving in the direction of the gas chambers and the death camps. Ed was just shaken. I mean, he was a very confident scientist, and with good reason. But he, for a few days after that appeared, he told me, I was just asking myself, am I a fraud? Has my work all been for naught? Am I going to lose my professorship? What's going to happen to me? And then he said, wait a minute, I got to go back and see. So he went back and checked his footnotes, if you will. He looked at the references. There was the data. There were the conclusions justified by the data. And he said, at that point, I just got mad. which was a healthy response. Then he wrote a letter praising sociobiology to the New York Review. But for the next year, 2, 3 years, he really was plagued with people who were trying to basically kick him out of the profession because he had the temerity to suggest that human beings, he ultimately estimated maybe 10% of human behavior, not specific behavior, but how we learn, what our prejudices are in terms of the kinds of things that we value. He finally concluded about 10% of that was evolutionary in origin and 90% was learned behavior. Actually, someone else then, a few years later, pulled out some 3,000 identical twin studies that had been done over 70 years, a total of some 100 and something thousand identical twins, and concluded after reviewing all of those studies that it's more like 49% evolutionary and 51% learned behavior. I think the climax really was, there were two climaxes. One was when the Anthropological Society, which was sort of offended by the idea that anthropology might not really be the soul of it all, were going to vote him not to deliver a paper they had invited him to deliver. And Margaret Mead showed up just when they were about to vote with their 6-foot staff pounding on the floor and saying, "Am I to understand that we are about to vote on a matter of scientific evidence?" And everybody backed off at that point. Another meeting of the American Association for the Advance of Science a year or two later, he had a pitcher of cold water poured over his head by an activist in the audience and was really, really angry, not so much at the pitcher of water, but at the fact that no one in this audience of scientists came to his defense. They just sat there and let him deal with this problem that he faced. And what he did was dry his hair and go on with his lecture. That's all he could do. So it took a while before, and I think that was the turning point for Ed when he realized that he didn't want to have to deal with this kind of bitterness and conflict and academic sniping and so forth anymore. And that's also when the realization that the extinction rate was so high and getting higher turned him toward a kind of more outreach and dealing with the environment than he perhaps had before. So it was for us all in a way.
He returns to nature in his next book, Biophilia, which I wrote. The central tenet of that volume being that humans possess an innate tendency to seek connections with nature and other forms of life. It's actually very Thoreauvian, since we are in a museum that honors Henry David Thoreau. But talk a little bit about that, and then we'll go to his role as an activist.
Maybe that's a bit of a stretch. I don't know that he supported that argument with any hard and fast scientific evidence. I don't know what that evidence would be, but he certainly felt it from deep in his heart that we are a part of the natural world, that if the natural world fails, we must inevitably fail, and that there is some depth and grace and richness in the world that is there for human beings who have even a shred of possible feeling about it all. I mean, there may be people who are raised on concrete to the extent that they don't know anything about the world. I understand a lot of children think milk comes in cartons rather than cows, but he believed that profoundly, and that's been a book that I think people have been much moved by. And he went on with his writing in book after book. And, he really started writing books at a rapid pace when he retired from Harvard in, I think, 1998. He was not a man who would ever just sit still. He published maybe 20 or 25 books from 1998 to the end of his life, looking into every corner of the world that he could look into. There was a huge national park in Eastern Africa called Gorongosa, which was totally savaged and ruined during a civil war in the country where it's based. And it is now being restored with the largesse of a wealthy American entrepreneur. But they built a lab with Ed's name on it so that people from the country could be trained in the science. So it wouldn't just be foreign white folks coming in and doing a little science and going home. That was the kind of thing that Ed loved to be involved with and work with. And I think really had a lot of later happy years going out in the field, coming back, speaking to groups, drawing in wealthy volunteers. There is an ant with the curious name Harrison Fordi as its specific species name, because Harrison Ford, the actor, donated a great deal of money to the Half Earth Foundation. So Ed was that kind of man and found creative ways to bring people into this dream of his.
You've talked about it a little bit, but you write that he turned to become more of an activist in the later years. And again, you've alluded to it, but just describe a little more of the Half Earth Project and why it was so important to him.
He really did believe that if we didn't get a handle on the extinction of species, the world was going to be really savaged by the loss of species. Just the model of his island biogeography suggests that if you limit the number of species, the whole thing starts to fall apart. Mm-hmm. It's interesting that the last book that he was just starting to work on at the time of his death was going to be a huge synthesis of the whole field of ecology. And one day, the last time I saw him, I think, in person, because obviously COVID limited our contact later on in my research, he took out a white handkerchief from his pocket and shook it out. And it was a blank white sheet of cloth. And then he said, I've really gotten interested in Japanese origami. He said, if this is a new field where there aren't any living beings on it, and one arrives and he turned a corner, then another arrives and he turned a corner. And he started showing how folding this piece of cloth into all of its hills and valleys could be used to represent the way as species come together. Let me show it with my hands in this image. They start interacting in all these complicated and interesting ways. And it's in that complexity that you build a world that depends in intimate, detailed, richly complicated ways. You know, the idea, if you take the wolves out of Yellowstone, well, then those ugly wolves aren't there anymore. And then you find out that there's an overgrowth of, I don't know, antelope or whatever creature the wolves predated on. You just simply can't do that. And he was deeply concerned that the species extinction rate was so rapid. Mm-hmm. So he tried to find ways. At one point, he almost had the federal government preparing to invest in 50,000 PhDs a year in the field of ecology. But someone said, oh, why are we doing this? And that died. But what he came to was something that anyone could look at now, which is called the Encyclopedia of Life, and it's online. A book, if you will, where every species on Earth, as it's discovered and identified, has at least one full page on the screen with its names and its characteristics and its variations and everything that's known about that species locked in by linkage to whatever databases there are around the world that need to be linked. That in turn has led to a whole series of digital textbooks that are now being used in high schools and colleges with Ed's imprimatur on them to again and again try to encourage, first of all, the identification, as he put it, the completion of the great Linnaean project. Linnaeus, of course, having been the one who started the process of finding a scientific way to identify different species. The two-part thing that we all use to this day. finished the Linnaean project of identifying everything on Earth, he said one time, if a Martian landed in the world, the first thing he'd do is do a species survey. We haven't even done that with our own world yet, much less some other place. So he left behind in every way he could think of within the range of his abilities to raise money, to speak to groups, to do the science, to do the outreach in science. He started a foundation with the help of some fellow Alabamans or Georgians, I've forgotten which is now called the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation. They're behind the Half Earth Project, which is basically to save whatever wildernesses there are left in the world. To do what needs to be done in terms of fundraising and everything else to keep what we have before it's gone. Because once it's gone, it's gone.
We actually only have one question from the audience, and with Matt Sadovon, there's a lot of bird lovers. Did he do any research specifically on birds, or were they just part of the study of ecology that you're just talking about?
There's plenty in his book of sociobiology about bird life.
Mm-hmm.
But since he was primarily an entomologist, an invertebrate guy, I don't think he did any direct study. He spent a lot of time studying birds as a teenager. He lived in Washington, D.C. at the time. His father had been called back for some work there. And there is that gorgeous park where he spent all his spare time, and the museums, the Smithsonian, the Museum of Natural History. It's really where I think he got his vision of how you become a scientist.
Right. You talked about Harrison Ford. One of the blurbs for your book is by the singer-songwriter Paul Simon, and we won't ruin it. We'll let people read the book, but he makes a cameo appearance in the book too. But I read that what Paul Simon was attracted to was in a TED Talk that he heard E.O. Wilson give was a certain optimism. And yet I heard you in another talk you were talking about E.O. Wilson's book on human nature, and you thought there's a bit of a negative worldview that he had. You knew him directly. This is our last question. Is he an optimist, or is he a realist? How his worldview, what do you take away from him?
Ed, at the end of his life, excuse me, had really concluded that we were going to get past this particular choke point in our species. We're going to. He told audiences, I think we're going to solve the heating problem, solve the question of nuclear war. One by one, we've already begun to reach the point where the population explosion is turning around. We're probably going to level off at about 10 billion human beings in the world, which the world can sustain. In fact, half the world can sustain. So he really was optimistic about us being able to solve our problems. But back behind that, there is this other question, which opens his wonderful book. If there's one book of Ed's everyone should read, I think it's On Human Nature, which is kind of a general audience version of sociobiology. But it's rich and beautiful and well written. Ed was a wonderful stylist and a marvelous thinker. It opens with a discussion of when we've solved all these problems, when we have a steady state world and a steady state population, when everyone has been pulled up to a level of comfort and the species extinctions have been limited, we're going, he says, to wake up to realize that we are just another biological species among biological species, that we have, he says, no purpose beyond our reproduction and the reproduction of our kind. And that he saw, I always remember from my undergraduate years studying the history of ideas, Galileo and Copernicus changed our vision of the Earth at the center of the universe to just another Earth spinning among the stars. Darwin changed us from a creature specially designed by God to just another mammal in the firmament of mammals, something that's still in debate to this day. Wilson's argument is we don't have any ultimate transcendental purpose in life. We're simply mammals. We're creatures. We're very smart. We have large brains. They get us in a lot of trouble. We'll probably deal with that. But then what? And he saw that as a potential spiritual crisis for our species, just as those previous. I mean, poor Copernicus and Galileo got into a lot of trouble with the church. Darwin's still in trouble. He got in trouble with the church too. Ed won't be around, unfortunately, to discuss this, if you will. But there it is. He laid it out there as a possibility. Should we live so long? We still have to deal with nuclear weapons to close the circle of this discussion.
Well, Dick, thank you. Coming from the home of transcendentalists to end on a transcendental question seems appropriate.
Yes.
But thank you for bringing the life of E.O. Wilson to all of us in the new book, Scientist, E.O. Wilson, The Life in Nature, and in this fascinating conversation this evening. So we thank you for joining us.
He was a lovely, lovely man. I think anybody who meets him in his work will be delighted.
Great. And we thank all of you for viewing this evening. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.